Good morning, Chris. It's the 1st of December, can you believe it? And here we are, approaching Christmas.
That's right. I mean, I don't think it is. It's never too early to say Merry Christmas, is it? And a Happy New Year. But we're getting there slowly. And the really good news, the better news, apart from the sunny weather today on the 1st of December, albeit slightly cool conditions, is that financial markets are behaving. They're a little bit stronger. When we talked last month, we said, well, we'd had a strong October at that point. We were saying, can this continue for the rest of the year? And of course, we were hopeful, as we always are. It's always best. The glass is always half full and not half empty after all. But November has actually surprised me by being this good. And I'm saying that obviously, despite the fact, sadly, we've still got geopolitical matters, we've got recession fears, we've got cost of living crises, all of which are important issues, and we can certainly discuss those later. But financial markets are performing better, be you an equity investor, a bond investor, or even a bit of cash in the bank. All of that has done a little bit better this month, which is a good thing. And that's always how people should be. The glass is always half full.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I feel that November's been that opportunity for investors to take a gasp of air, really, and to sort of calm and sort of think about things more logically. So it's been a good sort of respite in that respect. Let's hit on some of those geopolitical risks then that we've got today. I think one of the biggest ones out there that we've certainly seen and markets have reacted over the last couple of days has been COVID and the riots in China. What's your take on what we're seeing in China then, Chris?
So first, to me, finally, a bit of common sense amongst the Chinese Communist Party is slowly kicking in, a realization that even the Communist Party can't stop people wanting to live a more normal life. Reality is therefore kicking in. Sadly, they will actually have more COVID problems over upcoming months. But frankly, if I told you that in China today, you have around about 50,000 people with COVID, and we perhaps try to contrast that with what we would see here in the UK or the States or somewhere else, if we attempted to try to measure the data, the realization is we had our big COVID challenges a couple of years ago. Fortunately, thankfully, the world has slightly moved on, and we're living with it through all the right reasons, taking medicine and everything else. We're learning to live with this challenge. I think the Chinese have just been a bit slow at taking this up, but they're starting to understand that you have to get vaccinated, you have to ultimately accept that you can't have zero COVID, and you've got to crack on. And if they don't, actually, the Chinese Communist Party, despite being in charge for 70 odd years, will ultimately face political problems themselves, even in China, because people realize that when they see people elsewhere in the world living a more normal day-to-day life, enjoying seeing friends, going for lunch, or whatever it might be, they will have angst. Actually, though, if you go to China, my guess would be it's actually a little bit more normal than we would think. And certainly I think some of the indications that we saw a few days ago is not indicative of the whole of China. Certainly certain parts of it are seeing big lockdowns and everything else, but I think reality is starting to kick in there. Actually, from a Chinese economic perspective, this is good news. Sadly, will mean more people catching COVID and unfortunately sometimes having severe problems with it over upcoming months. But we can already see by the performance of the Chinese stock market over recent weeks, a realization that life is becoming a little bit more straightforward and a bit more sensible for 2023 and onwards is kicking in. And of course, we've seen that in general global markets too, because clearly a China which is more likely to have economic growth and progress is something which, from an economic perspective, from a market perspective, suits us all.
Yeah, because let's face it, the Chinese economy plays a big part on the global economy, doesn't it? A lot of our goods are made and exported from China, so any interruption in that service is going to have knock-on effects, isn't it? So that's China then. I think the other big thing that's been in the news lately has been cryptocurrencies, and I know you share the same sort of philosophy as me on this, Chris, that we're not big fans of it. We try and avoid it. Clearly, that platform going bankrupt and essentially investors losing their money has had huge knock-on effects over the whole of the cryptocurrency market. And in particular, we've seen Bitcoin being one of the biggest currencies out there take a real hit. Do you think that that is maybe good news for the normal stock market, and we might start seeing some of that cash come back into, buying good companies?
I think that's a fair point, and I think that probably had a little bit of an influence during November. This is why the aforementioned good performance of equity markets or even bond markets has been a little bit because money has flown back into these areas. But I think to me, it's also a manifestation of the fact that the last couple of years, we've seen a realization that the world can't always be marvelous. I would love the world to always be awesome, but it can't be. We all learn this early in our lives generally, but actually in the stock market, after a few years of good progress and profits and everything else, suddenly a lot of people start thinking this is the norm, this is how it's always going to be. And as we've talked about before, we were actually in hindsight spoiled a little bit in the 2010s. Everything was very good. Yes, we'd had our problems in 2008 and 9 in the stock markets, but the 2010s worked out really well. 2020s have been a bit different. We've had COVID, we've had economic uncertainties, we've had lots of geopolitical matters, etc., etc. I think finally people are saying, hang on, crypto, which is centered on a great hope, a great concept, and in early days actually sounded quite smart, alternative, different. There was a certain mild logic to it, but actually at the very high prices Bitcoin got to over the last couple of years, people were suddenly saying, hang on, this is either the next big generation, it's going to be the next marvelous thing to have, but it wasn't, and it isn't. And reality is, it should exist, it should be there should be people utilizing it, there is a rationale for it, but it's not at the current prices. My guess is it will be lower again over upcoming years. We shall see on that front. All I do know is that people are suddenly learning that you can't have something for nothing. And that's the reality we all learn about life in general, but also the financial markets. And Bitcoin had that sort of something for nothing feel to it. And for me, and I think for you, and I'm sure for many of our listeners, it's never been something which has been particularly appealing or interesting. You've been sort of looked at it in a sort of a what on earth is going on here sort of basis. But I think actually even those who bought Bitcoin and maybe actually did very well on it in the first few years or months, are now learning that nothing is always awesome. Nothing always goes your way. You have to ultimately do the boring stuff, work hard, understand what you're doing, and go from there. I'm afraid Bitcoin doesn't have those characteristics.
Yeah, I think it's that classic phrase, isn't it? If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Let's just finish up then, Chris, thinking about December. Historically, December tends to be a reasonable month for stock markets. Do you see that trend continuing, or are you worried about a particular challenge out there on the horizon?
So we have two things to wait for in December. I'd love to say that was Christmas. We could wait for that as well. That will come up eventually. Two big things to wait for. The first is the world's big central banks, Bank of England, of course, Federal Reserve in America, ECB in Europe. In mid-December, they've got their update over will they raise interest rates again? And I hate to give you a plot spoiler or something, but they will. They will raise interest rates again. But that's largely factored in. It's more on what they say around that as for their thoughts towards 2023. So that's one thing to look for. The second aspect, which is sort of linked with that, is what inflation is doing. How are we thinking about that for 2023 and what that means for the world? We will sadly have some periods of low growth, in fact, negative growth next year. We already know that. We've discussed this a number of times already. It is coming, but the reason why financial markets are looking forward and actually are performing okay in the last couple of months is because they're anticipating that actually by the time we get to this time next year, there'll be an anticipation of even better times. And that comes back to my underlying thinking, which remains, fortunately, that the world is still not impossible. It's still of interest. There are still good things going on. And we'll finally have, I would perceive also over upcoming months, a realization by Mr. Putin in Russia that life has to be undertaken a different way than perhaps he's preferred over the last 8 or 9 months. We shall see on that front. I don't think there'll be much movement in that in December. Sadly, the cold winter weather in Russia and Ukraine will slow down many of the discussions even over the war and related. would be my guess. But certainly from a December perspective, watch out for the comments from the central banks, watch out for the realities of inflation, and most of all, even more importantly, look forward to Christmas and the prospects of 2023.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chris. Thanks for all the commentary that we've had this year. Have a great Christmas, and we're going to be catching up in 2023. It's amazing that it's come round so quick.
Absolutely. Never too early to say Merry Christmas again. So Merry Christmas for everyone. Happy New Year. Look forward to speaking to you then.